Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through 25 different adult fantasy standalones and do a tier ranking of them, but I wanted to go about this tier ranking a little bit differently, where I also incorporated a little bit of a challenge. Because there are 25 books and 5 tiers, I wanted to force myself to put exactly 5 books in every single tier. And this should probably not need to be said, but just in case, I want to be clear that just because something ends up in the bottom tier does not mean I think it is a 1-star book, and just because something's in the top tier doesn't mean I think objectively it is absolutely perfect. This tier ranking is just truly fitting to my tastes as a reader, so I recognize that some of the books that are more toward the bottom, I still can completely understand why other people like them. They just didn't necessarily work for me. I'm gonna go ahead and start with the middle tier and then branch my way out into the top and bottom, so that way we get to our more extreme feelings at the end. But kicking it off with this middle tier, I'm going to start with Elantris. Elantris, naturally, by being a part of the Cosmere, I think in my mind it is lower, because I think of it in comparison to things like Stormlight Archive, Mistborn, Warbreaker, and in my head I'm like, well, it's not as good as those. But then at the same time I'm like, okay, but those are among some of the best of the best. When I actually just think about it as a standalone fantasy novel, it actually tells a really interesting story with a creative magic system and with a lot of nuance with the morality of the characters. It does a lot of that in one single story. Yes, a lot of us are hoping for it and wish to see someday a sequel to this, but currently it stands as a standalone just fine, and I think it does a good job of telling the story. Also within the middle tier, we have The Bone Orchard. This is a book that when I first read it, I actually was thinking that I didn't really enjoy it that much, but this is probably an obvious statement that many of us have experienced before. Enjoy is just not the right word for this book, and I couldn't really settle on how I felt about it, but at the end of the day, I couldn't get it out of my mind. Do I think that it could have gone about its themes in a more cohesive way? Yes. Although I think part of the story being convoluted, because if you don't know, the idea is you follow this individual, this group of people. It's up in the air. So you follow this individual who has fractured themselves into other beings. So they are somewhat a single person, but also somewhat multiple people. And the convoluted nature of the story, I think, is relevant to the way in which this person has split their mind in a sense so as to grapple with what they have endured in life, but you are trying to piece that together as you read it. It does make for a very different reading experience, which I really appreciate, but I'll always say I appreciate when authors take artistic chances. I always will love and applaud that, but it doesn't mean it necessarily always works for me, or doesn't necessarily always result in the best version of that story sometimes. Or maybe it does, but the best version of that story is just not going to be a favorite for me. So I respect this book a lot. I just have kind of complicated feelings about it. So it's in the middle tier, because I'm like, well, I wanted to feel more of the emotions. I think that's what it comes down to, because the themes, which I can't really say because it's part of the reveal and the mystery, the themes are really heavy, but I didn't really feel that much as a result of how the story was told. Next up, we have Goddess of the River. I, once again, really loved the themes in this story. I think it's absolutely heartbreaking. I do not think it's an easy book to read. I do think the way in which it has somewhat of a shift in perspective part of the way through did take away for me a little bit, because initially you're following one character, and then as you segue further in, you follow someone else as well, but it's been a very long time, and you don't really know that character as well as the person that you spent time with at the beginning, so I felt like I never really got to connect with them as much as I would have liked. That's probably really the only reason that this is in this middle tier. After that, we have Ariadne. I appreciate that the author wrote this story in a way that felt true to the original while adding something to it and giving you a bit more of the perspectives that you might be missing from the original. However, this original story is kind of annoying. That's really all it comes down. The main character is a little annoying. Next up, we have Deal with the Elf King. And these are kind of consistently the books in the Married to Magic series. For me, these are kind of consistently just enjoyable. And I know this is going to sound weird, but I do kind of like, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but there are certain series or certain books or maybe even certain works by certain authors that I can always kind of go to knowing they're going to be middle of the road. And I am comforted in that. And what I mean by this is because so many of my favorite stories of all time are the ones that really take me through those highs and lows, they make me feel all the different emotions, I sometimes want something that's just a nice story. It's just pleasant to get through, and it feels like you can get lost in it, but you're not gonna maybe suffer too much during it. You're not going to have to really put yourself through it as you're reading. It's just nice. And I like reading those kinds of stories sometimes between the other ones, because every now and then we go through things in life and they're already so draining of our emotions that every now and then, despite the fact that I love that in my favorites, and those are what make my favorites oftentimes, every now and then I just want to like something. It's almost like having that show that you throw on as a comfort show, a comfort watch, or a movie, and it's just on, and it's on while you're doing other things, because it's not so heavy or important that you feel like you got to watch every single moment. But then, maybe I'm wrong in this. I'm saying it like everybody experiences this, but I don't always want to put my favorite thing on all the time. Like, I've wanted for so long to rewatch Full Metal Alchemist, but I'm like, I have to wait until I can dedicate all my time and attention on it. Whereas I do love Parks and Rec too. I was going to say, though, it's easier to just like throw on Parks and Rec. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This is what these books are for me. They're just kind of like comfort reads. Now, switching to the fourth tier. So we're getting into somewhat negative feelings. They're not all bad, though. These are a lot of ones where I'm like, they just didn't ultimately work for me, but I can appreciate things about them. So first up, we have Starling House. I liked the idea of this. Once again, I liked the themes kind of on repeat here. It's very much about the ways in which people's stories are dictated by who had power at the time the events occurred. And so the victims, sometimes their true stories are not the ones that get remembered or told. And I really liked that was sort of a focus in this, and just stories in general and reputation. And there's also somewhat of a haunted house. It's not quite like that. It's like a creepy house. It's a aesthetic house, I guess you could say, in the story, but I don't know that haunted house is the best way to describe it. I did like that element of the story, and I didn't dislike the characters by any means, but I also just found that there was something missing a little bit for me. I think because I either wanted it to lean more into the fantasy or back off of the fantasy and just kind of be a fiction story with a lot of atmosphere built into it. I think that could have worked really well also. And it wasn't those things, and that's completely fine. It just ended up not working for my taste. Last Heir to Blackwood Library. I really enjoyed the beginning of this story. And part of this is, as you're reading, the main character seems to become less and less reliable of a narrator. And somewhat similar to The Bone Orchard, while I appreciate that decision the author made, and I feel like they executed it well, part of what didn't work for me in this one is, unlike The Bone Orchard, where I was like, it's hard for me to feel as emotionally gripped because of the convoluted nature. This one's like, I'm pretty sure I know what's going on, and it's kind of borderline annoying to watch her not know what's going on. And that's not fair to the character, but also I think I want to be lost and confused alongside them. And I don't know that I felt that as much as I wanted to. Next up, we have Clean Air. This is a book where I would categorize this as sci-fi, except there are some elements toward the end that sort of bleed into fantasy. And this one is sort of a futuristic society where you have people living in these domes almost, because plant life, the pollen, has become so deadly that we have to live as a society within these small contained places. And there's something very stifling about never really being able to go outside. But then there's like a murder mystery sort of at the same time, and everybody behaves really strangely, and our main character is somebody who remembers what it was like before they were all living in these domes, and before they went through the trauma of most of the rest of the world experiencing this apocalyptic like event. And I just always felt this sort of detachment from the character, which makes sense. I feel like it serves the story well, because that character doesn't even quite know how they feel. But it just all felt kind of, like very, what's the word I'm looking for? Not medical, but like when something's especially clean, sterile. That's the word I'm looking for. Sterile. It felt a little bit sterile. From there, we have one that I feel like is going to hurt some people, and that would be House in the Cerulean Sea. I can completely understand why this book resonates with so many people. I certainly think it's incredibly sweet, and I do like very sweet stories. There's a lot of books that follow a similar blueprint to this one that I do enjoy. The reason for me not loving this one primarily comes down to the fact that, for me, it was very cute, like very cotton candy cute. I wanted just a little bit more to sink my teeth into, but more so than that, I would say it's the fact that the main character is a little bland, and in a story like this, I wished they had a little more personality. I certainly think the kids in the story and the love interest in the story, I think they're so charming and delightful and full of personality, so much so they kind of make up for the lack of personality of our main character. And I understand the main character is supposed to be somewhat apathetic, but I'm like, well, apathetic isn't the same as lackluster, which I feel like they were. So with the love interest, I was like, I know why you love this person, but why would the love interest be interested in you? You're so bland. I'm boring. Anyway, but the themes are really beautiful and sweet and lovely. It's just, it didn't ultimately work out for me. And then we also have Honey Witch. I definitely think this book did something really interesting with its take on the sort of independent character. And I actually have said before that I would enjoy a story that tries to do this, which the idea is that we have this woman who's feeling very stifled by the pressure that is being put on her to get married, to be a mother, to be a wife, to have a family, and just be this perfect, like, Regency era lady. And she doesn't want that, and she's not quite sure what is causing her to not want this, but it kind of comes down to the fact that she has magic, and she discovers this, and discovers that she could help out this community with her magical powers and become a witch. And that's the path that calls to her, magic calls to her, and she genuinely loves her profession, but in choosing this profession, she finds herself to be very, very lonely. And so I actually kind of liked when it first started, she was pretty unlikable, and she would look down at women who didn't want this sort of life for themselves, and she'd look down at people who felt the need to seek out companionship. She was kind of a snob to them. So the book ends up exploring loneliness and the want for independence for yourself, but companionship too. And I think it tackled those things well. I just didn't really care too much about the conflicts within the story and the world. I think I was expecting a little bit more for what I thought the book was going to be. A lot of times stories that lean into the cozy or lean into sort of this cottage feel, I find tend to have really vivid, lovely settings, and this one, it had it, but it wasn't as much as maybe I was hoping for. Jumping up now to the second tier, I think there's going to be some surprises in the second tier, but I'm going to start with Untethered Sky. Maybe this is a surprise too, I don't know. I liked Untethered Sky a lot. Weirdly, I thought everything on paper for Jade City was going to absolutely check all the boxes for what I like, but I ended up just not liking the characters, and it seems like everybody else loves Jade City. And then I picked up Untethered Sky, and it felt like a lot of people who love Jade City didn't love Untethered Sky, but then I really liked it. I thought it was so cinematic. I thought that for a book that is very short, because it's, I think, technically a novella, it's very short and it covers a large period of time, I thought there's no way I'm going to feel all that much connection to the story or investment in what's happening, and I did, and I could visualize everything. And I really liked to sort of push and pull with the dynamic between the rocks, which are like these giant birds, and their handlers. I loved that it still was like this wild animal, but that there was this bond and their purpose in protecting people from these manticores. I thought it was so cool. I loved it. I really liked it. It's not maybe an all-time favorite, that's why it's not in the top, but I really, really liked it. Also, we have Legends and Lattes. I did really like this. It was one of the first cozy fantasies I picked up, and I completely understand why so many people have been inspired by this. Writers and readers alike, there's just something so lovely about starting fresh and starting new and feeling so much for the person who's trying to make something of their life in a new chapter. I think it's great. You don't really see too many books that are like this. You don't see too many books, or at least you didn't at the time that this, really started to pick up. You don't really see too many books that are focusing on a slightly older protagonist that is entering this different era, you could say, of their life. And just the sense of found family and community, I think, is lovely. Also, speaking of lovely, we have Tress of the Emerald Sea. This was one that I debated putting in the middle tier, but when I thought about it, I was like, no, I like this more, I think, than the others. It's just very cute. It's very wholesome. And I do feel like it's cute and wholesome and adventurous, because certainly a lot of cozy stories, they kind of feel settled into a place and you're sort of building community around that. Whereas this one's cute and cozy, but on an adventure, and you go places, and it allows for the world to be opened up to you. And talk about an interesting, unique world. This one has some of Sanderson's most different world building that we've seen, and dangerous world building, and colorful and unique and bizarre and horrifying world building. So even though it's a cute adventure story, also so much to the world, which I really appreciated. Next up, we have Babel. Depending on the tier ranking video I'm doing and what this is going up against, I feel like sometimes this goes in the middle tier and sometimes it goes in this tier. For today, in comparison to the ones that are in the middle tier, this one for me was stronger in a lot of ways. There are bits and pieces of it that if I'm being picky, I would have wanted to go about a different way, or I wanted actually more perspectives. I feel like that would have really enhanced the themes of the story. However, regardless of that, the themes are such heavy ones, and I really can respect R.F. Kuang approaching them and dissecting them, and I do wish we had more time with them. I don't know if this one book was quite as much as I was wanting, and I don't know if the main single perspective that we get in this was as much as I was wanting, but I still really applaud what was done within this. And then probably the most out of left field book for me to have here would be The Wolf and the Woodsman. I feel very alone in liking this book, but I did like it. I liked the folklore elements of the story, and I liked the writing, and I liked the atmosphere, and I guess atmosphere and setting go hand in hand, but there's aspects of them that are a little different. I just liked a lot about it. Do I love these characters? Not necessarily. Do I have a lot of the themes that really sit with me? No. But all those other things that I mentioned liking, I liked them a lot. And I would reread this at some point because I do feel like almost always I read stories and the characters and their arcs are what stand out to me the most, and the other things kind of come second, unless the world's really unique. Sometimes it's the world that stands out. But this one, it was the setting and atmosphere and the writing that I enjoyed and soaked in. So if I were to reread it, I almost wonder if it would enhance my experience, because then I would get to appreciate the characters' arcs even more than I did the first time. I don't know. But there's something about this that just really clicked with me, even though I feel like it doesn't click for that many other people. Now getting to the extremes, bottom tier. Speaking of a story that has a lot of folklore elements, Uprooted. I did not like Uprooted, which I love Spinning Silver. Spoiler, it's in the top tier. I love Spinning Silver, but oh my gosh, I couldn't stand Uprooted. I found the main character annoying. She was kind of insufferable. And the whole dynamic between her and the wizard I didn't like, and the progression of the plot was not my taste. Even though I feel like The Wolf and the Woodsman followed a somewhat similar feeling, I just Uprooted. The more I read, the more I just didn't like it. I didn't care for it. I kept getting aggravated and annoyed and being like, oh my gosh, we're doing something else now? We're meeting another new person? How long is this book? So I just kind of kept feeling like that, which is not really how I want to feel. And then next up we have, I don't feel bad about this, Ocean at the End of the Lane. No. Orquidea Divina. I really wanted to love this story, and I just rarely like generational tales. I don't know what it is, and it makes me really sad because this seems to be kind of a device used within a lot of South American stories, and I am half Cuban, and I would love it if I could see more of that in my fantasy stories, more South American influences, but it's so rare in fantasy, and when it does show up, it tends to lean toward this generational, like you're following several different people. Oftentimes it's like you're following the women from every generation, or something like that, and I don't end up usually liking the way in which those stories end up being told, because I never feel like I really get to learn about anybody more than, I'm not saying this book is surface level, but it feels sometimes like it's not as much depth, every individual piece is surface level, which can create a bigger, more important thing overall, but I'm like, no, but I like those little pieces, I want to know more about them. So Orquidea Divina didn't quite work for me. Wild and Wicked Things. This is a book that was a Great Gatsby retelling. I feel like there was a weird time where there was several Gatsby retellings, and this was one of them. I'm not the biggest Gatsby fan, so you gotta really, really do something to make me like a Gatsby retelling. And this one kind of just didn't as much as I would have liked. There were aspects to it that could have really worked, but they just ultimately didn't. And then Song of Achilles. I hate Achilles in this story. I can't stand him. I can't stand him at all. I think he is so obnoxious and so annoying that it makes the book unbearable for me. Even though I liked the writing a lot. And like when I first started, I was like, oh wow, I just feel like so invested in this tale. And then I was like, never mind, here's Achilles and he sucks and I don't care anymore. And then I finished it because I'm not a completionist, but I was far enough in. And I'm just like, gosh, this sucks. He never learned. He sucks. I hate him. And it just didn't change. So I ended up disliking the story as a result. But I don't think the writing's bad. I would read something else by Madeline Miller. Now going up to the top tier. I already revealed Spinning Silver's here, so let's just give it some more love. I love Spinning Silver. I love it. I actually really feel like the way in which Naomi Novik was able to capture the characters, because you do follow a lot of different characters, and when you go to a new character, you're never told who you're now following. Like when a new chapter starts, it's not like Miriam and then switch to a different character. You just have to figure it out, because it doesn't always say in the narration right away either. So you just kind of have to figure out by what's going on around you and the voice. And I actually think she did a phenomenal job with it. And I just think everybody's arcs in this are incredible, and the ways in which everybody, despite the fact that many of them don't actually have literal powers at their fingertips, they still find ways to be powerful. I say it all the time, and it's just inspiring and great, and the way that the atmosphere is tied to everything, and the folklore, so good. I love Spinning Silver. Nettle and Bone, of course. I love Nettle and Bone. Love, love, love. The cheekiness of this story, the humor, the fact that it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it does have serious themes, which it doesn't shy away from, and it somehow strikes that balance really well. I think it's great. I mean, who's surprised? Nobody. I love these. Sword of Kaigen, of course. Oh my gosh, this book. We all know when it does that part. If you've read this book, you know there's a part where you're like, that just happened, and it's devastating. And then there's a part later where you're like, oh my gosh, this is the most emotional confrontation between these characters. And there's a lot of other parts in between. Like there's a part that is so distinct in my mind, and it's weird because I have a visual memory in my mind of that scene, even though I read it. I didn't see it on a screen, but I remember it, this character with their back turned, and this other character is experiencing something so devastating. Oh my gosh, it's so good. I love Sword of Kaigen. Plus the magic's great and the action's great. The story's great. And despite the fact that it has some weird parts to it, when I first started, I was like, what is this? Despite that, it still turned out to be one of my favorite standalones of all time. And then we have Best Served Cold. I just feel like this was such a preview for me into what I was going to get with Age of Madness, because I enjoyed First Law. But it wasn't maybe I got a scream from the rooftops sort of a story for me. Then I read Best Served Cold, and I was like, oh, dang. If Abercrombie keeps delivering on this level and keeps doing this into his series, I think I'm in for a good time. And then I read Age of Madness and I was like, oh my gosh, it was so good. I love it. And Best Served Cold is just such a fantastic standalone. It does such a great job of telling a story, having great characters, having a good plot, which is something I feel like gets criticized about Abercrombie's works, or his plots, or the plotting. But this one, it had a really clean plot, but you still have great characters. Nothing felt forced, or it's just so good, and it's fun, and it's I was gonna say it's fun and it's violent. I don't love it because it's violent. I just mean like it has everything. It's just great. And then last for today, we have the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I have said before, I completely see the criticisms of this. I get it. Absolutely. The powerful moments in this were so powerful to me that that's why I still wanted to include it at the top. I don't know that I love it as much as a lot of the others in this top portion of the standalones, but I do really quite like some of those moments are just so devastating. And I think V.E. Schwab has a way of writing them in an artistic way while simultaneously making you feel what the character's feeling, and then putting yourself in that position, being like, oh my gosh, what would I do? How would I feel? And I think that takes a lot. I mean, because sometimes things that are written in a very artistic way or very beautiful way or borderline kind of flowery, they can actually take away from the emotions, because sometimes what makes something so emotional is how raw it can be. And so she kind of, I don't want to say she romanticized everything in this necessarily, but everything was written in this kind of lush way. But I still felt so impacted by some of the moments in this. So that's why it's at the top. But anyway, that's it for a list of 25 different adult fantasy standalones. And I will have in the description bar down below, if there are reviews or videos where I go more in depth about these, I'll have them linked, since I know this was more of an overview about the books themselves. So if any of them you're interested in hearing more about, I'll have that information in the description bar. Let me know where your shared feelings are, and then the feelings where you're like, oh no, I feel totally different about that book. And then I actually have 25 additional adult fantasy standalones that I could do the same style video for, so I might do that sometime in the near future. We'll see. I also have 25 YA standalones that I could do this for, so once again, I might put this out in the future. We'll see. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.